Who doesn't love a good ghost story? Throughout the ages, people have been having eerie encounters, whether it's hearing otherworldly noises or catching something odd out of the corner of your eye, or perhaps even a full-blown haunting. Ghosts are woven into so many aspects of our culture: folklore, music, literature, films, you name it. Now, whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. The Greenbrier ghost is the only known case where testimony from a ghost helped to convict a murderer.
You're having me on. Sounds like a load of rubbish to me.
Nope, I'm not. I'm deadly serious, and here's the true story to prove it. Our story takes us to the Richlands area of Greenbrier County in West Virginia. A small farming community with greenery as far as the eye could see. Beautiful fields, rolling hills, a quiet remote area with a very tight-knit community. The first character I need to introduce you to is Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe. Quite the name. He was in his early 30s and the son of a notable blacksmith. He spent the first part of 1896 travelling from town to town to town in search of a new start, but unfortunately he'd had little success. Things are always better and brighter in the summer though, and his luck would change. He arrived in Greenbrier, where he found a job as a blacksmith. Fabulous stuff. He would soon meet Elva Zona Heaster, the 23-year-old daughter of a farmer. She liked to go by Zona. She had long, beautiful black hair, was strong-willed and had a very intense look about her. Now, I need to point out that apparently Erasmus was devastatingly handsome. He was tall, he was muscular, and he had striking blue eyes.
I don't see it. He looks shifty. He's certainly no chisel gargoyle.
Yes, he's not a gargoyle, but anyway, he was definitely Zona's cup of tea. She fell for him the moment she laid eyes on him, and the two would make a beautiful couple. After a whirlwind romance, they were engaged to be married. Zona was really close with her mother, Mary Heaster, and they were often mistaken for sisters. Mary, of course, wanted the best for her daughter, and she wished that the two would just take things a bit more slowly. I mean, Erasmus was practically a stranger. They'd hardly known each other for any time at all, and he was from out of town. Erasmus was kind and charming with a disarming smile. He'd won over the whole town and her daughter. Mary wasn't convinced though. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was just something she didn't like about Erasmus. Zona and Erasmus were head over heels for each other, and despite Mary's protest for them to wait a little while longer, they married on October the 26th, 1896, in a Methodist church. The two had moved to the other side of Greenbrier, where they would set up home in a lovely and cosy two-storey house. Their newlywed bliss would be short-lived though. Unfortunately, Zona would fall ill, and we're not sure what this mysterious illness was, but some suspect that she was pregnant and suffering from complications with this. She was put under the care of a local physician called Dr. George Knapp, and he would treat her for several weeks. Erasmus doted on Zona. He tried to take care of her as best as he could. He would even enlist the help of a local errand boy to help Zona whilst he was at work. Martha, a very lovely woman who was known affectionately as Aunt Martha in the community, lived near the blacksmith shop. Her 11-year-old son, Andy, would often help people in the village with errands and little odd jobs and things like that. On the 23rd of January 1987, it was a particularly busy day at work for Erasmus, and he couldn't get back home to check on his beloved Zona. He visited Aunt Martha to see if Andy could pop by his house to make sure that Zona was okay, and also find out if she needed anything from the shops. Martha agreed to let her son help, but only after he'd finished his chores for Dr. Knapp. Erasmus was really worried about Zona, so he went back to Martha's house quite a few times to see if Andy had been able to check on his wife yet. Over an hour later, Andy had finally finished his work for Dr. Knapp, and so he set off to check on Zona. Winter was harsh in these parts. It was bitterly cold. He trudged up the snowy hill as he had done on many occasions. But this time when he arrived at the house, something didn't feel right. He knocked on the door, but Zona didn't answer. He tried again. Still nothing. He tried opening the front door, and it would turn out that it was actually unlocked. So he slowly made his way inside. It was dark, which was strange. Evening would soon be approaching, and no lanterns had been lit. He made his way further into the house. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the creak of wood under Andy's feet. His eyes widened. At the bottom of the stairs was Zona's lifeless body. One arm was by her side and the other across her chest. Her head was cocked to one side. He tried not to panic. Maybe she was just sleeping. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. Andy started to fear the worst. He ran over to her and knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. He reached out and gently shook her, but there was no response. Her body was stiff and it was cold. She looked up at him with cloudy, unblinking eyes. Poor Zona was dead. Andy leapt up and rushed out of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran down the snowy hill all the way back home. He tried to tell his mother what he'd seen, but he just couldn't get the words out. He was so shocked, so scared. Martha got him to calm down and breathe. And finally, he managed to tell her what had happened. The two of them went to break the news to poor Erasmus. The colour drained from Erasmus's face. He couldn't believe what they were telling him. The tools he was holding dropped to the floor with a loud clang, and he rushed off home, Martha and Andy closely behind. When they arrived, it was just as Andy had said. Zona was lying lifeless at the bottom of the stairs. Erasmus ran over to his wife and touched her. She was stiff and cold. He screamed at Martha to get Dr. Knapp. She nodded and rushed off to fetch him, Andy in tow. It would be quite a while before Dr. Knapp would arrive, and in that time Erasmus had begun to prepare Zona's body for burial. He carried Zona upstairs, he bathed her and dressed her in the beautiful crimson gown, complete with a long stiff collar that she'd worn on their wedding day. He carefully laid Zona out on the bed. He gently closed her eyes and covered her face with a long black veil. It was usually the women in the community that would prepare the body for burial, but perhaps Erasmus felt that he really needed to take care of Zona, even in death, and this was just part of his grieving process. When Dr. Knapp finally arrived, he found Erasmus cradling Zona in his arms, overcome with grief and weeping uncontrollably. Dr. Knapp checked her for signs of life, but he could find none. Because Zona had died so quickly and unexpectedly, he thought that maybe it was an everlasting faint, which is what they called something like a stroke or a heart attack. Dr. Knapp tried to examine Zona's body a little bit more closely, but Erasmus was very, very much in the way, and he wouldn't move. He tried to examine her neck, and Erasmus got a little bit agitated with him. He was just far too grief-stricken, and he couldn't bear to let go of Zona. Erasmus cradled her body even closer to him, and this meant that Dr. Knapp couldn't really get a good look. Dr. Knapp realised that Erasmus was absolutely beside himself, and so, out of respect, he didn't push the matter further. The examination was cut short. He sent a messenger to let the Heaster family know the devastating news. Back then there was the tradition of sitting up with the dead. So, Zona's body was taken the 2-hour ride back to her childhood home on the farm. She was then placed in what would have been her old bedroom. All her friends, her family and neighbours would spend the night at the farm, keeping a close watch over Zona. Now, at the wake, Erasmus was very, very protective of his beloved Zona. He didn't let anyone near her body. He placed her head on a deep pillow and put a knotted sheet on one side of her neck so that she could rest easier. He also put a beautiful scarf around her neck. It was her absolute favourite, and Erasmus just knew that she'd want to be buried with her. Erasmus was still beside himself with grief. He was weeping, sobbing, wailing. He was to be the centre of attention, not Zona. Sometimes he jumped up and he paced back and forth. He had various outbursts. His behaviour was a bit odd, but people grieve in different ways. Mary, Zona's mother, was seething. She glared at Erasmus. How dare he try and make this about him? The contempt she felt for Erasmus was palpable. People could see the hate in her eyes. The next day, as Zona's body was transported for the funeral, another thing that people could see was that Zona's neck was a little bit loose. Her head was a little bit floppy.
Foul play. I call foul play. It's all too suspicious.
I mean, apparently it's not uncommon for corpses to have floppy heads. Heads are heavy and corpses' necks are easily broken through normal handling. But I agree. Suspicious. The funeral was short and sweet. At the end of the ceremony, Mary kissed her daughter's cheek and said her final goodbyes. She then removed the knotted sheet and the pillow from the coffin so that it could be closed. She tried to return these to Erasmus, but he didn't want them. That night, Mary decided to wash the sheet that was used to prop up Zona's neck. Mary was horrified. As she washed the sheet, the water in the basin turned crimson red and an awful smell filled the air. It was the smell of death. The water suddenly returned to normal, but the sheet was stained pink. Mary took this as a sign. She knew in her heart that there was something strange about Zona's death, and she vowed to get to the bottom of it. Mary was a religious woman, and so she turned to God. Every night she would go into her daughter's room, lie down in her narrow bed, and pray for a sign. Pray for her daughter to reveal the truth about her death. For weeks she prayed and she prayed, until one night her prayers were answered. She could see a soft glow in the corner of the room. Strange. The light grew brighter and larger until it was almost blinding. Then there was a chill in the air, and the light transformed into Zona. Zona stood before Mary wearing the same crimson red dress that she was buried in. Mary was a bit scared at first, understandably, but her fear soon dissipated. This was her beloved daughter. She had to be brave, she had to be strong and find out the truth. She asked Zona what had happened. How did she die? Zona explained that Erasmus was an awful man. The worst kind of man. Charming to the world, but abusive and cruel when no one was looking. He was violent and he flew off the handle at the smallest things. On this particular day, she was feeling really unwell. She couldn't muster the energy to cook, but she knew that Erasmus would be arriving home shortly. She quickly prepared a cold meal of bread, butter, fruit, and preserves. When Erasmus arrived, he was furious that she hadn't cooked and that there was no meat for him. He wanted meat. He deserved meat. In a fit of anger, he grabbed Zona by the neck and violently began to choke her. He had choked her to death. Mary was saddened by Zona's story, but not surprised. Her mother's intuition had told her that Erasmus was not a good man. She reached out to touch her daughter, and she felt just as real as when she was alive. Zona's ghost gradually faded away, leaving Mary sitting all alone in darkness. Mary didn't tell anyone about what had happened that night. The next day passed in a blur. All she could think about was her poor daughter and what she had told her. She waited until the rest of the family was asleep and once again prayed to see Zona. And once again Zona appeared before Mary in a flash of light. Mary tried to ask her daughter some questions, but this time she didn't answer them. Instead, she said, "Ma." He took his hands and he squeezed my neck off at the first joint. Suddenly, it felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, making you want to gasp for breath. There was a look of pure terror in Zona's eyes. Her face began to contort in pain. It was as if someone was lifting her off the ground by her neck. Her eyes rolled backwards, her body convulsed, and she fought for breath. Then there was an awful cracking sound like the snapping of bone, and Zona's head turned all the way around. Mary watched in horror as this terrible scene unfolded. After a while, Zona's feet finally returned to the ground. Looking at her mother with sadness in her eyes, she walked away, her head facing one way, her body the other. She then disappeared. It all made sense now. The scarf, the pillow, the rolled-up sheet, the high-necked collar. These were all an attempt to disguise the fact that Zona's neck had been broken. This encounter really shook Mary. She ran out of the room and quickly got into bed next to her husband, who was fast asleep. Zona's visits continued over the next 2 nights, replaying the same awful scene again and again. It got to the point where Mary she couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't keep watching that scene. She couldn't keep hearing about how Erasmus had snapped her daughter's neck. She stopped praying to see Zona, and she worked up the courage to tell the rest of her family about the visits. She was a bit worried that they wouldn't believe her, but to her relief, they all did. They were suspicious of Erasmus too, and this confirmed it for them. She then worked up the courage to tell her neighbours about Zona's ghostly visits and how Erasmus had killed her daughter. It would turn out that they too were actually already suspicious of him. Remember his odd behaviour at the funeral? Well, that stuck in people's minds. Also, rumours of his dark past had started to spread around town. It would turn out that Zona was not his first wife. He'd had 2 before, and my goodness was he an abusive husband. He beat one of his wives so badly that a mob got together to try and teach him a lesson. They dragged him from his bed and they threw him into an icy river. His next wife would die only 8 months after marrying him, very suddenly and under rather suspicious circumstances. The neighbours urged Mary to raise her concerns with the prosecuting attorney, John Preston, and see if he'd reopen the case on her daughter's death. Mary took a wagon to Preston's very grand estate and requested to meet with him. She told him about Zona's ghost, the broken neck, and that Erasmus had killed her daughter. Preston listened intently. He took her claims very seriously. He took down details of anyone that might be able to provide information on the case, and of course he contacted Dr. Knapp to find out about the autopsy. Dr. Knapp admitted that he'd had to cut the examination short because of how grief-stricken Erasmus was. It was decided that a full and proper autopsy needed to be carried out to reveal the true cause of Zona's death. So, work began to exhume Zona's body. It was the dead of winter and the ground was frozen rock solid. It took hours of back-breaking labour to get that coffin out of the ground. One plus point about the bitterly cold weather was that Zona's body had been perfectly preserved. It looked just like the day it was buried. 3 doctors would carry out the autopsy, and the examination would be a very, very thorough one. They checked her stomach for signs of poisoning, but nothing. What they did notice though was that Zona's final meal was just as her spirit had said. Bread, butter, fruit and preserves. No meat. Erasmus was also at the autopsy, under advice from a constable who would accompany him. Throughout the autopsy, Erasmus went on and on about how her death was clearly due to natural causes, or maybe she fell down the stairs, but there was absolutely nothing suspicious about it. The doctors ignored him though. Finally, they would examine Zona's neck. They gently removed the scarf and the stiff high-necked collar. As they did, her head lolled to one side. The doctors became silent. They could all see finger-shaped bruises around Zona's neck. On closer examination, they noted that Zona's neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. Sadly, the attack on her was so vicious that the ligaments in her neck were ruptured and her windpipe had been crushed. It was just as Zona's spirit had said. The doctors declared that Zona had been murdered. She had been strangled to death. When Erasmus heard this, he wasn't upset at hearing that his wife had been murdered or wanting to find out who had done this to her. Oh no. Instead, his response was, "They can't prove that I did it."
Ooh, he definitely did it. I told you he looked shifty.
Yep, his response says it all, really. Erasmus was arrested and put in the Lewisburg jail. He was so cocky though. He laughed and he joked that the evidence against him was so flimsy he'd never be put on trial, let alone convicted. I mean, I understand why he was cocky. The evidence against him was purely circumstantial. So not direct evidence, and it was very, very rare for somebody to be convicted based on circumstantial evidence. But oh how wrong he was, he would be put on trial. Mary was of course called to give evidence, and everybody thought that the story of Zona's ghost would take centre stage. But Mr. Preston did not say a word about it. You see, he was worried that this might damage the credibility of their case. Erasmus's lawyers, on the other hand, thought that they could use the ghost story to their advantage, make Mary look unreliable and superstitious. They were ruthless in their questioning, trying so hard to discredit her, but my goodness did this backfire. Mary was composed, level-headed and unwavering in her account of Zona's ghostly visits. Many people in the community already believed Mary, and this worked in her favour. Her account was so compelling that none of the lawyers objected and the judge did not declare it inadmissible. It would be the first time that the testimony of a ghost was allowed in a USA court. After the final arguments were given, the jury would deliberate for just over an hour. The verdict was then announced. They had found Erasmus guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to a lifetime in prison. Erasmus was transported to Moundsville Prison, narrowly escaping a lynching. You see, many people wanted him hung for his crimes. 3 years into his life sentence, on the 13th of March 1900, he would die from an epidemic of influenza that devastated the prison, killing dozens and dozens of prisoners. So, was Mary really visited by her daughter's ghost? Well, I'm not sure. Mary and Zona had such a strong bond, and a mother's intuition can be a powerful thing. Some think that the ghost story was actually a very, very clever plan to get her daughter's case reopened, appealing to the superstitions of the community and getting a lot of dramatic media attention. If she'd accused Erasmus herself without the vehicle of a ghost and her accusations weren't taken seriously, perhaps Erasmus might try hurting her. I mean, it would seem that he'd killed before. What would stop him from doing it again? Very interestingly, in the paper that had reported on Zona's death, there was an article about another ghost story, one of the most famous Australian murder cases, the Fred Fisher case. In this case, the ghost of a murdered man would sit and point to where his body was buried. It would actually turn out that a man who'd witnessed the killing had made up the ghost. He couldn't himself reveal where the body was because he'd been threatened with murder if he said anything. So he spread the story of the ghost, and soon other people were seeing the ghost. So many people were seeing it that it prompted a search, the body was found, and the killer was convicted. Perhaps Mary saw this article and she tried to employ the same tactic. Whatever the case, Mary managed to get justice for her daughter, and who doesn't love a good ghost story? If you got something from this video, please like and subscribe, it would be very much appreciated. Gargi will really appreciate it too. Stay safe, make sure to listen to your mother. They're always right, and I hope you have a magnificent day.